Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. My name is Walter Allen, and I am 78 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened to me on July 12, 1998. I remember it like it was yesterday. I had been working non-stop for months as a freelance writer, juggling deadlines and battling writer's block. The stress was getting to me, and I desperately needed a break. That's when I decided to take a solo camping trip in my RV. I had this old Winnebago that I'd bought secondhand a few years back. It wasn't much to look at, but it was reliable and comfortable enough for a weekend getaway. A friend of mine had told me about this secluded spot in the backwoods of Maine. He said it was peaceful, a good place to fish and relax. It sounded perfect. I packed up some supplies, loaded my golden retriever Cooper into the passenger seat, and hit the road early on a Friday morning. The drive was long but pleasant. As we left the city behind, the landscape gradually transformed. Concrete and steel gave way to rolling hills and dense forests. Cooper sat with his head out the window, tongue lolling in the wind. His excitement was contagious, and I found myself grinning as we wound our way along the narrow country roads. It was late afternoon by the time we reached our destination. The sun was hanging low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the dense forest. I found a small clearing near a creek that looked perfect for setting up camp. I parked the RV, making sure it was level, and stepped out to survey the area. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of pine and earth. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant call of a bird. It was a stark contrast to the constant noise of the city, and I felt the tension in my shoulders start to ease almost immediately. I set up my little campsite with a folding chair, a small table, and a grill for cooking. Cooper explored the area, his tail wagging furiously as he sniffed every tree and bush within reach. As I was arranging things, I noticed something odd. About 100 yards away, partially hidden by a cluster of trees, was an old pickup truck. The truck looked like it had seen better days. Its once red paint was now a patchwork of rust and faded color, and the tires seemed to be slowly sinking into the soft earth. It struck me as strange to see another vehicle out here, especially one that looked like it had been abandoned, but I shrugged it off, figuring it probably belonged to some old-timer who used the lake as his private fishing spot. With the campsite set up, I decided to try my luck at fishing. I grabbed my rod and tackle box and headed down to the creek, with Cooper trotting along beside me. The water was clear and cool, and I could see small fish darting about in the shallows. I found a comfortable spot on the bank and cast my line. As I sat there enjoying the peace and quiet, I couldn't help but feel like something was off. It was too quiet. There were no crickets chirping, no frogs croaking, just the occasional splash of a fish jumping in the creek. It should have been relaxing, but something about the silence made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. After about an hour, with no luck on the fishing front, I packed up and headed back to the campsite. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. I lit a small campfire and set about cooking the dinner I had packed, some hot dogs and beans. Simple camping fare, but it smelled delicious after a long day of driving and setting up camp. As I sat by the fire, eating my dinner and sharing some hot dog with Cooper, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. The shadows cast by the fire seemed to dance at the edge of the clearing, creating moving shapes that my mind kept trying to turn into something sinister. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just my city-dweller brain unused to the deep quiet of the forest. After dinner, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. I grabbed my flashlight, though I didn't think I'd need it yet, and set off down a narrow path that led deeper into the woods. Cooper came with me, sticking close to my side as we ventured into the growing darkness. The forest was different at night. The trees seemed to loom larger, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The path, which had seemed clear and inviting in the daylight, now felt like it was closing in around us. I walked for about half an hour, trying to enjoy the solitude, but that nagging feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. Just as I was about to turn back, I heard a rustling in the bushes off to my left. At first, I thought it was just a deer or maybe a rabbit, but then I heard it again, closer this time. I stopped and listened, my heart starting to beat a little faster. Cooper's ears perked up, and he let out a low growl. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. "Is someone there?" There was no response, just another rustle, this time from behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but saw nothing but trees and undergrowth. Cooper was on high alert now, his body tense and ready to spring. "Come on, boy," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Let's head back." We started back down the path, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every few steps I'd hear another rustle or the snap of a twig, always just out of sight. I picked up the pace, nearly jogging by the time the campfire came back into view. Back at the campsite, I added more wood to the fire, building it up until the flames leaped high into the air. The extra light made me feel a little better, pushing back the darkness and whatever might be lurking within it. Cooper settled down next to my chair, but he remained vigilant, his eyes scanning the tree line. I tried to relax, telling myself that it was just my imagination running wild. I was a city boy after all, not used to the sounds and movements of the forest at night. But as I sat there, staring into the fire, I couldn't help but feel that something was very wrong. It must have been close to midnight when I heard it. A long, low moan that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't an animal sound, at least not like any animal I'd ever heard. It was almost human, but distorted somehow, filled with a pain or anguish that made my skin crawl. Cooper jumped to his feet, barking furiously at the darkness beyond the fire's light. I stood up too, my heart pounding in my chest, and shone my flashlight out into the trees. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything unusual. Just the same trees and bushes that had been there all along. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. "This is private property, you need to leave." There was no response, just another of those terrible moans, closer this time. Cooper's barking grew more frantic, and he started to move towards the sound. I grabbed his collar, not wanting him to run off into the dark. "Inside, Cooper," I said, my voice shaking. "We're going inside." I quickly doused the fire and gathered up my things, all the while feeling like something was watching me from just beyond the reach of my flashlight. We retreated to the RV, and I locked the door behind us, drawing all the curtains tight. Inside the RV, I turned on every light I could, trying to create a safe bubble of illumination. Cooper paced restlessly, stopping every now and then to growl at the door. I sat at the small table, my flashlight and an old baseball bat I kept for protection close at hand. As the night wore on, the sounds outside grew stranger and more frequent. Sometimes it was that awful moaning, sometimes it was heavy footsteps circling the RV, and sometimes it was a light tapping like someone or something was testing the walls for weakness. I didn't sleep a wink that night. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. I kept expecting to see a face appear at one of the windows, but there was never anything there when I looked. When dawn finally broke, it felt like I'd aged years in a single night. The forest outside was quiet now, the morning sun driving away whatever nightmares had stalked the darkness. I made a strong pot of coffee and sat looking out the window, trying to make sense of what had happened. In the light of day, it all seemed absurd. Had I really spent the entire night cowering in fear over some strange noises? I was a grown man, for heaven's sake, not some kid at summer camp telling ghost stories. I decided that I must have let my imagination run wild, fueled by too much solitude in an unfamiliar environment. Determined to salvage my weekend, I decided to spend the day exploring the area. I packed a small backpack with some essentials, water, snacks, a first aid kit, and of course my trusty flashlight. Cooper seemed eager to get out as well, his tail wagging as I hooked on his leash. As we set out, I noticed something odd. The old pickup truck I had seen the day before was gone. There were tire tracks leading away from where it had been parked, still fresh in the soft earth. It made me uneasy. Had someone been out here last night? Were they responsible for the strange noises? We hiked along the creek for a couple of hours, the exercise and fresh air helping to clear my head. Cooper enjoyed himself, splashing in the water and chasing after squirrels. We even found a small waterfall, the water cascading down moss-covered rocks into a clear pool below. As we sat by the waterfall, eating our packed lunch, I tried to rationalize the events of the previous night. Maybe it had been some local kids playing a prank. Or perhaps there were coyotes or other animals in the area that I wasn't familiar with. Anything seemed more plausible than some unknown creature stalking the woods. On our way back to the campsite, we passed by where the old truck had been. I stopped to examine the area more closely. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the mud, large ones, much bigger than my own, and they didn't look entirely human. The prints were elongated, with what looked like claw marks at the end of each toe. They led from where the truck had been, circled around our campsite, and then disappeared into the dense underbrush. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Cooper whined softly, pressing against my leg. I hurried back to the RV, my mind racing. What had made those prints? Why had they been circling our camp? And most importantly, were they still out there? Once back at the campsite, I debated what to do. The rational part of my brain said to pack up and leave, to get back to the safety of civilization. But another part of me, the part that had always been drawn to mysteries and unexplained phenomena, wanted to stay and figure out what was going on. In the end, curiosity won out. I decided to stay one more night, but I took some precautions. I moved the RV to a more open area where it would be harder for anything to sneak up on us. I gathered extra firewood and built up a large fire, planning to keep it going all night. I also dug out an old camera I had brought along, thinking I might be able to capture evidence if anything strange happened again. As the sun began to set, I felt my nerves start to fray. Every sound from the forest seemed magnified, every shadow a potential threat. I kept the fire blazing and sat with my back to the RV, Cooper by my side and the baseball bat within easy reach. The early hours of the night passed uneventfully. I began to think that perhaps the previous night had been a fluke, that whatever had been out there had moved on. But then, just after midnight, it started again. It began with the moaning, that same horrible, pain-filled sound I had heard the night before. It seemed to be coming from all around us, echoing through the trees. Cooper started barking, his hackles raised. I stood up, bat in hand, and scanned the darkness beyond the fire's light. That's when I saw it. Just at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind a large pine tree, was a figure. It was tall, much taller than a normal person, and seemed to be covered in dark, matted fur. Its eyes caught the firelight and glowed an eerie yellow. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The creature took a step forward into the light, and I got my first clear look at it. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. It walked on two legs, but its feet were elongated and ended in sharp claws, the source of those strange prints I had seen earlier. Its arms were long, nearly touching the ground, and its hands were more like paws, also tipped with vicious-looking claws. But it was the face that truly terrified me. It was a twisted mix of human and animal features. The snout was elongated, like a wolf's, but the eyes were disturbingly human-like, filled with an intelligence that seemed to bore right through me. I raised the bat, my hands shaking. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. The creature tilted its head, almost as if it was curious. Then it opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp teeth, and let out another of those bone-chilling moans. It took another step forward, and I could smell it now, a rank, musky odor that made my stomach turn. Cooper was going berserk, barking and growling, straining at his leash. I wanted to run, to jump in the RV and drive away as fast as I could, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to move. The creature took another step and another. It was at the edge of the fire's light now. I could see saliva dripping from its jaws, its claws flexing as if in anticipation. This was it, I thought. This is how I die. But then something unexpected happened. A loud bang echoed through the clearing like a gunshot. The creature's head snapped around, looking towards the source of the noise. There was another bang and another. The creature let out a howl, not a moan this time, but a sound of pure animal rage, and then it turned and loped off into the darkness. I stood there, bat still raised for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. My legs were shaking so badly I thought I might collapse. Cooper had stopped barking and was now whining softly, pressing against my leg. Then I heard footsteps approaching. I turned, ready to defend myself, but instead of another monster, I saw an old man emerge from the trees. He was carrying a shotgun and had a grim expression on his weathered face. "You all right, son?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak just yet. The old man came closer, keeping his shotgun ready. "You shouldn't be out here," he said. "These woods ain't safe, especially not at night." What was that thing?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. The old man shook his head. "Best not to ask too many questions about that. Some things a man's better off not knowing." He introduced himself as Frank. He lived in a cabin a few miles away and had been tracking the creature for years. He wouldn't tell me much about it, just that it had been in these woods for as long as anyone could remember, and that it was dangerous. Frank helped me pack up my things and followed me in his truck as I drove the RV out of the woods. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, a small place called Millfield. Frank took me to a diner there, bought me a cup of coffee, and told me to go home and forget what I'd seen. But how could I forget? That creature, whatever it was, had changed everything. The world I thought I knew, with its rules and logic, had been turned upside down in a single night. I drove home the next day, my mind still reeling from what had happened. I told a few friends about my experience, but most of them just laughed it off, saying I must have imagined it, or that it was probably just a bear. But I know what I saw. In the years since, I've done a lot of research. I've looked into folklore and cryptozoology, trying to find some explanation for what I encountered. I've even gone back to those woods a few times, though never alone and never at night. I've never seen the creature again, but sometimes when the wind is right, I swear I can hear that mournful moan echoing through the trees. I'm an old man now, and I know most people would dismiss my story as the ramblings of a senile mind. But I know what I saw that night, and I know it was real. The memory of those glowing yellow eyes and those razor-sharp claws still haunts my dreams. Over the years, I've heard whispers of similar encounters in those woods. Hikers gone missing, campers fleeing in the middle of the night, locals warning outsiders to stay away after dark. It seems I'm not the only one who's crossed paths with the creature. I've often wondered about Frank, the old man who saved me that night. What did he know about the creature? How long had he been hunting it? I tried to find him again years later, but his cabin was abandoned, reclaimed by the forest. The locals in Millfield claimed they'd never heard of him. Cooper lived to a ripe old age, but he was never quite the same after that night. He became more protective, more alert. Until the day he died, he would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, growling at shadows only he could see. As for me, that experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I became more cautious, more aware of the thin veil that separates our orderly world from the unknown that lurks just beyond. I never went camping alone again, and to this day, the sound of rustling leaves in the dark is enough to make my heart race. I've tried to write about that night many times over the years, but the words never seem adequate. How do you describe something that shouldn't exist? How do you convey the bone-deep terror of coming face to face with the impossible? Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is blowing just right, I find myself listening for that moan. Part of me hopes I'll never hear it again, but another part almost wishes I would. Because as terrifying as that encounter was, it was also exhilarating in a way. It was proof that the world is bigger and stranger than we can imagine, that there are still mysteries out there waiting to be uncovered. I'm nearing the end of my life now, and I find myself thinking about that night more and more. Was the creature real, or was it some kind of shared hallucination brought on by fear and isolation? And if it was real, what was it? Some undiscovered species? A genetic experiment gone wrong? Or something older? Something that has lurked in the shadows of human civilization since time immemorial? I don't suppose I'll ever know the answers to these questions, but I do know this. Those woods hold secrets, dark and ancient secrets that are perhaps best left undisturbed. And yet there's a part of me that wishes I could go back just one more time, to stand in that clearing again, to feel the weight of the unknown pressing in from all sides. Because for all the fear and trauma that night brought me, it also gave me something precious, a glimpse behind the curtain, a peek at the true nature of our world. And once you've seen that, well, you can never really go back to seeing the world the same way again. So if you find yourself in those woods someday, and you hear a moan on the wind or see yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness, remember my story. Remember that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows of our understanding, and whatever you do, don't go into the woods alone at night, because you never know what might be waiting for you in the darkness. As I sit here, pen in hand, trying to capture the essence of that night, I can't help but wonder, is it still out there? Is it roaming those woods even now, waiting for another unsuspecting camper to stumble into its territory? And if so, what will happen when our ever-expanding civilization finally encroaches too far into its domain? These are questions I'll likely take to my grave, but I've written this account in the hope that someday someone might find it and understand. Understand that the world is vast and mysterious, that there are things out there beyond our comprehension. And perhaps, armed with this knowledge, they'll be better prepared than I was if they ever find themselves face to face with the unknown. As for me, I've made my peace with what happened. I've lived a long life, filled with joys and sorrows, triumphs and failures. But nothing in all my years has affected me as profoundly as that night in the woods. It opened my eyes to a world of possibilities, both wondrous and terrifying, and for that, despite the fear and the nightmares, I'm grateful. So as I close this account, I leave you with this final thought. The next time you're in the wilderness and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, that sense of being watched, don't dismiss it, because you never know. You might just be in the presence of something ancient, something primal, something that reminds us that we are not and have never been alone in this world. And with that, I lay down my pen. The story is told, the memory preserved. What happens next is up to you, dear reader. Will you dismiss this as the ramblings of an old man? Or will you look at the world a little differently, a little more cautiously, knowing what might be out there in the shadows? The choice, as always, is yours. But remember, the unknown is always waiting just beyond the light of your campfire, and sometimes, if you listen closely, you might just hear it calling your name. As the years passed, I tried to put the experience behind me, but it was never far from my thoughts. I threw myself into my work, taking on more photography assignments and traveling to different parts of the country. But no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. One crisp autumn day, about 5 years after my encounter in the Allegheny National Forest, I received an unexpected letter. The envelope was plain, with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message scrawled in messy handwriting. "The forest remembers. It's time to return." My heart raced as I read those words over and over. There was no signature, no explanation, just that cryptic message that sent a chill down my spine. I knew without a doubt that it was connected to my experience in the forest. For days, I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to ignore the letter, to continue with my life, and forget about Skara and the strange events of that summer. But another part of me, the part that had always been drawn to the unknown, urged me to go back. After a week of internal struggle, I made my decision. I would return to the Allegheny National Forest, face my fears, and hopefully find some answers. I packed my RV, making sure to bring extra supplies and equipment. This time, I was determined to be prepared for whatever I might encounter. The drive to the forest was tense. Every mile brought back memories of that fateful trip. As I entered the forest, the familiar scent of pine and damp earth filled the air. It was late afternoon when I reached the clearing where I had camped before. Everything looked the same, yet somehow different. The trees seemed to loom larger, their shadows stretching towards me like grasping fingers. I parked the RV and set up camp, my movements mechanical as I tried to calm my nerves. As night fell, I sat by the campfire, listening intently to every sound in the forest. The darkness seemed to press in around me, alive with unseen presences. Around midnight, I heard it, the same heavy footsteps I had heard years ago circling the RV. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. "I'm here," I called out, my voice shaking slightly. "I got your message. What do you want?" Silence answered me, then a rustling in the underbrush. I swung my flashlight towards the sound and caught a glimpse of something moving, not an animal, but not quite human either. It was tall, its form indistinct, like a piece of the forest come to life. Without thinking, I followed it. The entity led me deeper into the forest, always staying just out of clear sight. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I tried to keep up. After what felt like hours, I found myself in a small clearing. In the center stood the old cabin. It looked exactly as I remembered it, dilapidated, forgotten by time. But now, in the pale moonlight, I could see that the symbol on the wall was glowing faintly. As I approached, the glow intensified, pulsing like a heartbeat. Suddenly a voice spoke from behind me. "You have returned." I spun around, my flashlight illuminating the speaker. It was an old man, his face weathered and lined, his eyes gleaming with an otherworldly light. He wore simple, worn clothes that seemed to blend with the forest around him. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The old man smiled, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too feral. "I am many things," he said. "Guardian, protector, punisher. Your people once called me Skara." My mind reeled. This couldn't be real. Yet here I was, face to face with the entity that had haunted my dreams for years. "Why did you bring me back here?" I managed to ask. Skara's expression turned grave. "The forest is in danger," he said. "Humans encroach further every day, destroying that which they do not understand. You, Bruce Nelson, have seen the truth. You have felt the power of the ancient woods. Now you must help protect it." I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. "How? I'm just a photographer. What can I do?" Skara approached me, his movement fluid and silent. He reached out and touched my forehead with a gnarled finger. Instantly my mind was flooded with images. Clear-cut forests, polluted streams, dying animals. I saw the beauty of the untouched wilderness and the destruction wrought by human hands. When the visions faded, I found myself on my knees, gasping for breath. Skara stood over me, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and determination. "You have a gift," he said. "Your camera can capture the truth of this place, show the world what is at stake, make them see the beauty and the danger." I nodded, understanding dawning on me. This was why I had been drawn back here. This was my purpose. "I'll do it," I said, my voice stronger now. "I'll show them the truth." Skara smiled, a genuine expression that softened his feral features. "Good," he said. "But remember, the forest does not give up its secrets easily. There will be trials, dangers. Are you prepared to face them?" I stood up, meeting Skara's gaze. "I am," I said, surprised by my own certainty. For the next few weeks I lived in the forest, guided by Skara. He showed me hidden groves, secret caves, and places of incredible natural beauty. I photographed everything, filling memory card after memory card with images that seemed to pulse with life. But it wasn't all beauty and wonder. Skara also showed me the dark side of the forest, areas ravaged by illegal logging, streams choked with pollution, the corpses of animals killed by poachers. These images were harder to capture, but I knew they were just as important. As I worked, I began to feel a change within myself. It was as if the forest was seeping into my very being, altering my perceptions. I could hear conversations in the rustle of leaves, see messages in the patterns of bark. The boundary between myself and the natural world began to blur. One night, as I sat editing my photos in the RV, I heard a commotion outside. I grabbed my camera and flashlight and ventured out. In a nearby clearing, I saw a group of men with chainsaws and heavy equipment. They were preparing to cut down a section of the forest. Without thinking, I started taking pictures, the flash illuminating the scene in stark detail. The men shouted, angry at being caught. One of them rushed towards me, but before he could reach me, a loud roar echoed through the trees. The men froze, their faces pale with fear. From the shadows emerged Skara, but not in his human form. Now he was a creature of bark and leaf, towering over the men, his eyes glowing with an inner fire. The loggers ran, leaving their equipment behind. I continued to take pictures, my hand shaking but my focus unwavering. When it was over, Skara turned to me, slowly shifting back into his human form. "You see now," he said, "the battle we face." I nodded, understanding the weight of my task. Over the next few months, I threw myself into my work with a fervor I had never known before. I documented the beauty of the forest and the threats it faced. I captured images of Skara in his various forms, sometimes human, sometimes animal, sometimes something in between. As winter approached, I knew my time in the forest was coming to an end. I had a story to tell, a message to share with the world. On my last night, Skara visited me one final time. "You have done well," he said, his voice like the whisper of wind through leaves. "But your task is not over. The world must see what you have seen. They must understand." I promised him I would do everything in my power to share the truth. As dawn broke, I packed up my RV and prepared to leave. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of Skara in my rearview mirror, standing at the edge of the forest. Then he was gone, melting back into the trees. The months that followed were a whirlwind of activity. I organized my photographs, wrote articles, and reached out to environmental organizations. My work began to gain attention, first locally, then nationally. People were moved by the images I had captured, by the story of the forest and its ancient guardian. There were skeptics, of course. Many dismissed my tales of Skara as the ramblings of an over-imaginative photographer. But the images spoke for themselves. The beauty of the untouched wilderness, the devastation of human encroachment, these were truths that couldn't be denied. As my work spread, I began to see changes. More people visited the Allegheny National Forest, not to exploit it, but to appreciate its beauty. Conservation efforts increased. Stricter regulations were put in place to protect the land. But with the increased attention came new dangers. There were those who saw the forest as a resource to be exploited, who viewed my work as a threat to their interests. I received threatening letters, anonymous phone calls warning me to stop. I refused to be intimidated. I knew that what I was doing was important, not just for the forest, but for the world. The lessons I had learned from Skara, the connection I had formed with the natural world, these were things that needed to be shared. Years passed and I continued my work. I traveled to other forests, other wild places, always searching for the hidden wonders, always advocating for their protection. And sometimes, in the deepest, darkest parts of the woods, I would catch a glimpse of something, a shadow moving against the trees, a pair of gleaming eyes in the underbrush. And I would know that Skara, or something like him, was there, watching, protecting. Now, as I sit here in my study, surrounded by my photographs and memories, I can't help but reflect on the journey that began with that fateful camping trip. I'm older now, my hair gray, my face lined with the years. But when I close my eyes, I can still feel the pulse of the forest, still hear the whisper of Skara's voice on the wind. I know that my time is growing short. Soon I will have to pass on the task of protecting the forest to others. But I take comfort in knowing that I have done my part, that I have shared the truth of the ancient woods with the world. And sometimes on quiet nights when the wind blows just right, I think I hear a familiar voice calling me. It whispers of deep forests and hidden glades, of secrets yet to be discovered. And I know that one day when my work here is done, I will answer that call. I will return to the forest one last time, to walk among the ancient trees and stand beside their timeless guardian. Until then, I will continue to share my story, to show the world the beauty and mystery of the wild places. For in protecting them, we protect ourselves. We preserve the ancient wisdom, the deep magic that still lives in the heart of the forest. And who knows? Perhaps one day you too will hear the call of the woods. Perhaps you'll find yourself standing at the edge of a dark forest, feeling the weight of unseen eyes upon you. And if you do, remember my story. Remember that there are still wonders in this world, still mysteries to be uncovered. All you have to do is step into the shadows and listen to the whispers of the trees. My name is Edward Taylor, and I am 64 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened back in October 1987, but the memory of it is as fresh as if it were yesterday. I'd just gotten this old RV, a real piece of work from the 70s, but it had charm. I wanted to take it out for a spin, see some of the countryside, get away from my office job in Harrisburg for a bit. So I packed it up with supplies, grabbed my old dog Roscoe, and headed out to the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. Now the Allegheny is beautiful this time of year, all reds and oranges, leaves falling like rain. I found this secluded spot near the Clarion River, a place where I wouldn't be bothered. I parked the RV, set up camp, and got a fire going. Roscoe was sniffing around, happy as a clam. I cracked open a beer and just soaked it all in. The first couple of days were perfect. I'd fish in the river, cook up my catch, and just relax. There wasn't another soul around. The silence was profound, broken only by the gentle rushing of the river and the occasional call of a bird. It was exactly what I needed after months of being cooped up in my cubicle, staring at spreadsheets all day. One evening I was sitting by the fire, Roscoe at my feet, and I heard this rustling in the bushes. Now, I'm not the type to get spooked easily. I figured it was a raccoon or something, but Roscoe... He perked up and started growling. "Calm down, boy," I said, but he wouldn't. He was staring at the tree line, his fur standing on end. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the woods. Nothing. Just darkness and the occasional glint of eye shine from some critter. I shrugged it off and went back to my beer, but Roscoe remained tense, his eyes fixed on the forest. I tried to dismiss it, but there was something about his behavior that made me uneasy. Later that night I woke up to Roscoe barking like mad. I stumbled out of the RV, flashlight in hand, and tried to calm him down. That's when I noticed the strange tracks around the campsite. They were big, bigger than any animal I'd seen out here, and they weren't paw prints. They looked almost human, but with clawed toes. I told myself it was probably a bear with a weird gait or something, but the next day I found more of those tracks, leading from the river to the RV. It didn't sit right with me. I decided to keep a closer eye on things, maybe cut my trip short if it got any weirder. That evening I heard something again. This time it was closer, and it sounded like something heavy moving through the brush. I armed myself with a hunting knife. Didn't have a gun on me, which I was starting to regret. Roscoe and I sat in the RV, lights off, waiting. He was right beside me, growling low. I didn't sleep much that night. Around dawn I must have dozed off because I woke up to find the fire out and Roscoe gone. I called for him, but there was no response. Panic set in as I searched the area, following the tracks I found, which led deeper into the forest. The morning mist hung low, making everything look eerie and unfamiliar. I found him eventually, but it was too late. Roscoe was dead, his body torn apart like he'd been mauled by something big. It looked like the work of a bear, but those tracks, they weren't bear tracks. I buried him there, my heart heavy, and decided I needed to leave fast. As I was packing up, I heard a sound behind me, a low guttural noise that made my skin crawl. I turned, knife in hand, and saw it. This creature standing on two legs covered in matted fur, with eyes that glowed in the dim light. It was like something out of a nightmare, part man, part beast. I didn't stick around to get a better look. I jumped into the RV and floored it, tearing down the dirt road like a bat out of hell. I didn't stop until I reached a ranger station miles away. I told them what happened, but they didn't believe me. They chalked it up to a bear attack and a scared man seeing things. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist. I haven't been back to the Allegheny since, and I never will. Whatever that thing was, it's still out there waiting. I've spent years trying to put it out of my mind, but it always comes back, especially in the dead of night when I can't sleep. I've read up on folklore, trying to find something that matched what I saw. The closest I got was an old story about a creature called skookum, an old term some folks use for Sasquatch or Bigfoot. But this wasn't Bigfoot. It was meaner, more primal. I try not to dwell on it, but sometimes when I'm alone I can still hear that rustling in the bushes, see those glowing eyes in my mind. I don't tell many people about it because, frankly, who'd believe a guy like me? Just an old office worker who likes to camp. But you asked, so there it is. My name is Edward Taylor, and that's my story. Take it or leave it. But if you ever find yourself in the Allegheny National Forest, keep your eyes open. You never know what's lurking just beyond the firelight. The years since that incident have been challenging, to say the least. I tried to go back to my normal life, back to my job in Harrisburg, but things were never quite the same. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes staring back at me. Every rustle of leaves outside my window made me jump. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Reeves. He was patient, listened to my story without judgment. He suggested that what I experienced might have been a stress-induced hallucination, a manifestation of my subconscious desire to escape the monotony of my daily life. Part of me wanted to believe him, to accept that rational explanation and move on, but I couldn't shake the feeling of those eyes on me, the memory of those tracks in the mud. My work started to suffer. I couldn't concentrate, kept making mistakes in my reports. My boss, Mr. Johnson, called me into his office one day. He was concerned, said I wasn't the same since I came back from my camping trip. I couldn't tell him the truth. Who would believe me? So I made up some story about a bad case of food poisoning, said I was still recovering. He gave me some time off, told me to come back when I was feeling better. But I didn't get better. The nightmares got worse. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that the creature was right outside my bedroom window. I started drinking more than I should, trying to numb the fear, to get a few hours of dreamless sleep. One night, about 6 months after the incident, I hit rock bottom. I was sitting in my living room, half a bottle of whiskey in me, when I heard a noise outside. It was probably just the wind, or maybe a stray cat. But in my alcohol-addled mind, I was sure it was the creature. I grabbed my old hunting knife and stumbled outside, ready to confront it. My neighbor, Mrs. Grayson, found me the next morning, passed out on my front lawn, still clutching the knife. She called an ambulance, and I spent the next week in the hospital, detoxing and undergoing psychiatric evaluation. That was my wake-up call. I realized I couldn't go on like this. The creature, whether real or imagined, was destroying my life. I had to find a way to move past it, to reclaim my sanity. I threw myself into research. I spent hours at the local library, poring over books on cryptozoology, folklore, and unexplained phenomena. I reached out to other people who claimed to have had similar experiences. Most of them seemed like crackpots, but a few had a look in their eyes that I recognized, the look of someone who's seen something they can't explain, something that's shaken their understanding of the world. One of these people was a retired forest ranger named Frank. He'd worked in the Allegheny for over 30 years before retiring. We met at a small diner just outside of Harrisburg. Frank was in his 70s with a weathered face and hands that spoke of a lifetime spent outdoors. "I've heard stories," he told me, his voice low. "Things that don't make sense. Things that shouldn't exist. But they do." He told me about strange sightings over the years. Tracks that didn't match any known animal. Campers going missing only to turn up miles away with no memory of what happened. And once, late at night on a routine patrol, a glimpse of something moving through the trees. Something big, walking on 2 legs. "I never reported it officially," Frank said. "Who'd believe me? But I know what I saw, and I believe you, Edward. You're not crazy." Those words meant more to me than Frank could ever know. For the first time since that night in the forest, I felt a sense of validation. I wasn't alone in this. Frank introduced me to a small group of people who met regularly to discuss their experiences with the unexplained. There was Mary, a school teacher who'd had a close encounter while hiking in the Rockies. John, a truck driver who swore he'd seen something impossible one night on a lonely stretch of highway in Nevada. And Rachel, a young woman whose brother had gone missing in the woods near their family's cabin in Maine. We'd meet once a month, sharing our stories, our theories, our fears. It wasn't always easy. There were times when I'd leave those meetings feeling more unsettled than ever. But there was also a sense of community, of shared experience. We understood each other in a way that no one else could. Over time, I started to heal. The nightmares became less frequent. I was able to go back to work, to function in my day-to-day life. But I never forgot what I saw that night in the Allegheny. I never stopped looking for answers. I retired from my job a few years ago. With more time on my hands, I've dedicated myself to investigating other reports of strange creatures in the forests of Pennsylvania. I've hiked miles of trails, interviewed dozens of witnesses, and compiled a database of sightings and encounters. I'm not sure what I'm looking for exactly. Proof? Closure? Maybe I'm just trying to make sense of what happened to me all those years ago. But every time I hear about a new sighting, every time I find a set of tracks that don't quite match any known animal, I feel a mix of fear and excitement. Sometimes late at night I find myself thinking about going back to that spot by the Clarion River. Part of me wants to face my fears, to see if I can find any trace of what I encountered. But then I remember Roscoe, remember those glowing eyes in the mist, and I stay put. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened that night in October 1987. Maybe it was a hallucination, a product of stress and isolation. Maybe it was something more, something science can't explain. All I know is that it changed me, set me on a path I never expected. To this day, I can't look at the woods the same way. Every shadow holds the potential for mystery, for terror. But there's also a sense of wonder. The world is bigger, stranger than most people realize. And somewhere out there in the depths of the forest, something is waiting. Something that challenges everything we think we know about the natural world. My name is Edward Taylor. I'm 64 years old. And this is my ongoing search for the truth behind the shadow in the Allegheny. As the years passed, my obsession with understanding what happened that night in the Allegheny only grew stronger. I found myself drawn deeper into the world of cryptozoology and unexplained phenomena. My retirement savings, which I'd once dreamed of using for a quiet life of gardening and crossword puzzles, were now being funneled into equipment for my investigations. Night vision goggles, high-quality cameras, audio recording devices, and more. I started a blog, Shadows in the Woods, where I shared my experiences and findings. At first, it was just a way to organize my thoughts and connect with others who might have had similar encounters. But over time, it grew into something more. People from all over the country started reaching out to me, sharing their own stories of strange encounters in the wilderness. One day, I received an email that made my heart race. It was from a man named Robert who claimed to have had an experience eerily similar to mine in the same area of the Allegheny National Forest. He described the same kind of tracks, the same feeling of being watched, and even mentioned a low guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. I arranged to meet Robert at a small cafe in Warren, Pennsylvania, just outside the forest. He was younger than me, probably in his early 40s, with a haunted look in his eyes that I recognized all too well. As we talked, I could see the relief on his face, the same relief I'd felt when I first met Frank. The validation of knowing you're not alone, that someone else understands. Robert's encounter had happened just 2 years ago. He'd been on a solo camping trip, much like I had been. I thought I was losing my mind, he told me, his hand shaking slightly as he clutched his coffee mug. I didn't tell anyone about it for months. Who would believe me? I nodded, understanding all too well. What made you decide to reach out? I asked. He hesitated for a moment before answering. I think I saw it again, last week. I was driving home late at night on one of those back roads that wind through the forest. There was something in the road. At first I thought it was a bear, but then it stood up. My breath caught in my throat. Did you get a good look at it? Robert shook his head. It was too dark, but I saw the eyes. God, those eyes. They glowed in my headlights. And then it was gone, disappearing into the trees faster than anything that size should be able to move. We talked for hours, comparing notes, theories, experiences. By the time we left the cafe, it was dark outside. As we stood in the parking lot, I could see the edge of the forest looming in the distance, a wall of blackness against the night sky. What do you think it is? Robert asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. I don't know, but I intend to find out. That meeting with Robert reignited my determination. I decided it was time to go back to where it all began. I knew it was risky. The memories of that night still had the power to send me into a cold sweat. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the answers I sought were waiting for me in those woods. I spent weeks preparing for the trip. I upgraded my RV, installing security cameras and reinforcing the doors and windows. I bought a satellite phone, determined not to be cut off from help like I had been before. And this time I made sure I was armed, a decision that didn't sit entirely comfortably with me but felt necessary given what I had experienced. As I drove back into the Allegheny National Forest, I felt a mix of emotions: fear, excitement, apprehension. The familiar landscape brought back a flood of memories. I found myself scanning the tree line constantly, half expecting to see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me. I set up camp near my old spot by the Clarion River, but not too close. The sound of the running water was both soothing and unsettling, reminding me of those peaceful days before everything went wrong. As night fell, I sat in my RV, monitoring the feeds from my security cameras, listening intently for any unusual sounds. For the first few days, nothing happened. I hiked during the day looking for signs, unusual tracks, broken branches, anything out of the ordinary. At night, I'd return to the safety of my RV, always on high alert. It was exhausting, both physically and mentally. On the fourth night, something changed. I was jolted awake by a high-pitched sound, somewhere between a whistle and a scream. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. I fumbled for my glasses and looked at the security camera feeds. There, at the edge of the camera's range, I saw movement. My heart pounding, I zoomed in on the feed. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was only for a moment, but I saw a large, dark shape moving through the trees. It was too big to be a normal animal, and its movements were wrong. Fluid yet jerky, like nothing I'd ever seen before. I grabbed my satellite phone, intending to call for help, but then I hesitated. This was what I'd come for, wasn't it? The chance to see it again, to confirm that I hadn't imagined it all those years ago. With shaking hands, I put down the phone and picked up my camera instead. Slowly, carefully, I opened the RV door and stepped outside. The night was eerily quiet now, the earlier sound having faded away. I swept my flashlight across the tree line, my camera at the ready. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around, trying to locate the source of the sound, and that's when I saw them. Two glowing eyes just at the edge of my flashlight's beam. I raised my camera, my finger on the shutter button, but before I could take the shot, the eyes vanished. There was a rush of movement, the sound of something large crashing through the underbrush, and then silence. I stood there for what felt like hours, my heart hammering in my chest, waiting for it to return. But it didn't. Eventually, as the sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn, I retreated back to the safety of my RV. As I sat there reviewing the footage from my cameras, I felt a mix of frustration and elation. I hadn't managed to get a clear photo, but I had seen it. It was real. All these years, all these doubts, and now I had confirmation. But what exactly had I seen? The glimpses I'd caught didn't match any known animal. It moved like nothing I'd ever encountered before. And those eyes, they had an intelligence behind them that sent shivers down my spine. I spent the next week in the forest, hoping for another encounter. But whatever it was, it didn't show itself again. I found tracks, similar to the ones I'd seen all those years ago, but they always seemed to vanish, as if the creature could appear and disappear at will. When I finally left the Allegheny, I had more questions than answers. But I also had a renewed sense of purpose. I knew now, beyond any doubt, that there was something out there, something unknown to science, something that defied explanation. I threw myself back into my research with renewed vigor. I reached out to experts in various fields, biologists, anthropologists, even a few open-minded physicists. I shared my experiences, my footage, my theories. Some dismissed me outright, but others were intrigued. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a wildlife biologist from the University of Pittsburgh, was particularly interested in my findings. "What you're describing doesn't fit any known species," she told me during one of our long phone conversations. "But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. The world is full of undiscovered creatures." She agreed to accompany me on my next expedition into the Allegheny. Having a scientist by my side gave me a new perspective on my search. Elena taught me how to collect samples properly, how to document evidence in a way that would be taken seriously by the scientific community. Our first few trips together were uneventful, but Elena remained patient and curious. "Nature doesn't reveal its secrets easily," she would say. "We have to be persistent." It was on our fifth trip together that everything changed. We were setting up camp for the night when we heard that same high-pitched sound I'd heard before. Elena's eyes widened. "That's no animal call I've ever heard," she whispered. We spent the night on high alert, our cameras and recording equipment at the ready. Just before dawn we saw it, a large, dark shape moving through the trees at the edge of our campsite. Elena gasped beside me, her scientific skepticism crumbling in the face of what we were seeing. The creature moved with an unnatural grace, its form seeming to shift and change as it moved through patches of moonlight and shadow. And then it turned, and we saw its eyes, glowing, intelligent, and unmistakably aware of our presence. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, it watched us. I felt rooted to the spot, unable to move, barely able to breathe. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, melting back into the darkness of the forest. Elena and I looked at each other, both of us pale and shaken. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I shook my head. "I don't know, but now you see why I've been searching all these years." That encounter changed everything. With Elena's backing, my research began to be taken more seriously in scientific circles. We published papers, gave lectures, and gradually built a small but dedicated team of researchers, all focused on uncovering the truth behind the creature in the Allegheny. We've made progress over the years. We've collected hair samples that don't match any known species. We've recorded vocalizations that defy explanation. We've even managed to capture a few blurry photographs and videos. But the creature remains elusive. For every step forward we take, it seems to take 2 steps back into the shadows. It's as if it's playing a game with us, revealing just enough of itself to keep us searching, but never enough for us to truly understand what it is. And so, the search continues. I'm older now, my hair gray, my joints aching after long days in the woods. But I can't give up. Not when I know it's out there, watching, waiting. Sometimes, in my darker moments, I wonder if we're meant to solve this mystery. If perhaps there are things in this world that are beyond our understanding, that defy our attempts to categorize and explain them. But then I think of that night by the Clarion River, of Roscoe, of all the years I've dedicated to this search. And I know I can't stop. Not until I have answers. Not until I understand what it is that lurks in the shadows of the Allegheny. As our research team grew and our findings became more substantial, we began to attract attention from unexpected quarters. It started with a series of anonymous emails hinting at government knowledge of similar creatures in other parts of the country. At first I dismissed them as the ramblings of conspiracy theorists, but then came the phone call that changed everything. It was a crisp autumn evening, much like the one when I first encountered the creature all those years ago. I was in my study, reviewing some recent field notes when my phone rang. The voice on the other end was deep, authoritative, and decidedly cautious. "Mr. Taylor," the voice said, "my name is Agent Simmons. I'm with a specialized branch of the Fish and Wildlife Service. We need to talk about your research in the Allegheny." My heart raced. Was this validation or the beginning of a cover-up? I agreed to meet Agent Simmons at a neutral location, a quiet diner just outside of Pittsburgh. When I arrived at the diner the next day, I found a man in his 50s, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of physique that suggested years of field work rather than desk duty. He didn't look like the government agent I'd imagined. "Mr. Taylor," he said, extending his hand, "thank you for meeting me. What I'm about to tell you is classified. I'm risking a lot by reaching out, but I believe your work is too important to be silenced." Over the next 2 hours, Agent Simmons painted a picture that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The creature I'd encountered in the Allegheny wasn't an isolated phenomenon. Similar beings had been spotted in remote areas across North America, in the Pacific Northwest, the Ozarks, even as far north as the Yukon. "We've been tracking these sightings for decades," Simmons explained, his voice low. "There's a pattern, but we're no closer to understanding what these creatures are or where they come from." I leaned in, my coffee long forgotten. "Why are you telling me this? Why now?" Simmons sighed, rubbing his temples. "Because we're at a dead end. Our superiors want to bury this, pretend it doesn't exist. But some of us, we believe the public has a right to know. Your research, Dr. Rodriguez's involvement, it's bringing scientific credibility to something we've been struggling with for years." He slid a USB drive across the table. This contains some of our findings, sighting reports, a few grainy photos, audio recordings. Use it, but be careful. There are people who don't want this information getting out. As I left the diner, my mind was reeling. The USB drive felt like it was burning a hole in my pocket. I couldn't wait to get back to my lab and dive into its contents. The data on the drive was a goldmine. It corroborated many of our theories and provided new avenues for research. But it also raised troubling questions. If these creatures were so widespread, how had they remained hidden for so long? And more importantly, what were they? Over the next few months, our research took on a new intensity. We cross-referenced our findings with the government data, identifying patterns and connections we'd never seen before. We expanded our field research, sending teams to some of the hotspots Simmons had identified. But as our work progressed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Cars would follow me for a few blocks before turning away. I'd catch glimpses of unfamiliar faces lurking at the edges of our campsites. Elena noticed it too. "Edward," she said one evening as we were reviewing some new data, "do you think we're in danger? Maybe we should go public with what we know for our own protection." I considered her words carefully. The thought had crossed my mind, but I was hesitant. If we go public now without concrete proof, we'll be laughed out of the scientific community. We need something irrefutable. Elena nodded, but I could see the worry in her eyes. "Just be careful, okay? This is bigger than we imagined." She was right, of course. It was bigger than we'd imagined, and it was about to get even more complicated. It was during a routine expedition in the Allegheny that we made the breakthrough we'd been hoping for, and dreading. We were testing a new type of thermal imaging camera, hoping to capture clear footage of the creature. As night fell, we set up our equipment in a clearing, the same one where I'd had my first encounter all those years ago. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. Hours passed with no activity, and I was beginning to think it would be another fruitless night. Then, just as the first light of dawn was beginning to creep over the horizon, our sensors went wild. Something large was moving through the underbrush, circling our camp. I held my breath, my hand steady on the camera controls, and then it stepped into the clearing. The thermal imaging painted it in shades of red and orange, but the shape was unmistakable. Bipedal, but not human. Massive, easily 7 feet tall, with long arms that nearly reached the ground. Its head was elongated, almost conical, and as it turned to look directly at our camera, I saw those eyes again, glowing not with reflected light, but with an inner intelligence that sent chills down my spine. For several long moments it stood there, as if studying us as intently as we were studying it, and then, to our amazement, it raised one of its hands. The gesture was unmistakable. It was waving at us. Before we could react, it turned and looped back into the forest, moving with that strange, fluid grace I remembered from my first encounter. We were left in stunned silence, our cameras having captured every moment of the encounter. As we huddled around our equipment, reviewing the footage with shaking hands, I felt a mix of elation and terror. We had our proof, clear, undeniable evidence of the creature's existence. But that wave, it suggested a level of intelligence, of self-awareness that raised a host of new questions. "We need to get this back to the lab immediately," Elena said, her voice trembling with excitement. "This changes everything." I nodded, but a sense of unease was growing in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't shake the feeling that by capturing this footage, we had crossed a line, that the rules of the game had changed. As we packed up our equipment, I noticed movement at the edge of the clearing. For a moment, I thought the creature had returned. But then I saw the glint of metal, a gun barrel catching the early morning light. "Get down," I yelled, just as the first shot rang out. We dove for cover as bullets peppered the ground around us. Through the chaos, I saw dark-clad figures emerging from the trees, moving with military precision. "The cameras!" Elena shouted. "We can't let them get the footage." I nodded, my heart pounding. While Elena provided covering fire with the hunting rifle we'd brought for protection, I scrambled to grab our most important equipment, the thermal camera and its precious footage. We ran, crashing through the underbrush, the sound of pursuit close behind us. I felt a burning sensation in my arm. A bullet had grazed me, but there was no time to stop. We had to get to the RV, to safety. As we burst out of the tree line onto the road where we'd parked, I saw something that made my heart sink. Our RV was engulfed in flames, a clear message from our pursuers. We were cut off with nowhere to go. "This way," Elena gasped, pulling me towards the river. It was our only chance, to lose ourselves in the water and hope for a miracle. As we stumbled into the rushing current of the Clarion River, I clutched the thermal camera to my chest. Whatever happened, we had to protect this evidence. It was too important to lose. The cold water shocked my system, nearly causing me to lose my grip on the camera. Elena and I fought against the current, trying to put as much distance as possible between us and our pursuers. The sound of gunfire faded, replaced by the roar of the river. Just as I thought we couldn't go on any longer, I felt something grab me. For a terrifying moment, I thought it was one of our attackers. But the grip was too strong, too sure. I turned my head and found myself staring into those glowing eyes I knew so well. The creature had come to our rescue. With impossible strength, it pulled Elena and me from the river, carrying us effortlessly through the forest. I wanted to speak, to ask the 1,000 questions that were racing through my mind, but I was too exhausted, too overwhelmed. Eventually, we stopped in a small cave, hidden behind a waterfall. The creature set us down gently, then stepped back, regarding us with what I could only describe as concern. "Thank you," I managed to croak out, still clutching the camera. The creature made a series of clicks and whistles, a language I couldn't begin to understand. Then, to my amazement, it reached out and touched the camera. It knew what we had captured. It understood the importance of our discovery. As Elena and I huddled in the cave trying to process what had happened, I realized that everything had changed. We had our proof, but at what cost? Who were the people trying to silence us? And most importantly, what was our responsibility now? To science, to the public, and to the incredible being that had saved our lives. The creature stood at the entrance of the cave, its massive silhouette framed by the cascade of water. It was standing guard, protecting us. In that moment, I understood that we had become part of something much larger than a scientific investigation. We had stumbled into a hidden world, a secret that some would kill to protect. As the adrenaline of our escape began to wear off, the reality of our situation set in. We were cut off from civilization, presumed dead by our attackers, with only the clothes on our backs and the precious footage we'd captured. And our only ally was a creature that, until recently, had been nothing more than a legend. Elena voiced the question that was on both our minds. "What do we do now, Edward?" I looked at the creature, then back at Elena. "We find a way to tell the world the truth," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "But first we need to understand, really understand,